Hello? Let's continue with thoughts on Colossus, The Price of America's Empire by Neil Ferguson. This is chapter 4. And remember, this book was written in 2004. So it's interesting to read. Like, again, I'm interested in this era specifically because I was in, I want to say middle school, right? During this time. And I didn't really understand what was going on. And we sort of see the aftermath of what this book is talking about when I'm in, I guess, high school, and a little past that as well. So it's interesting reading about some of the news, just some of the views, which I didn't really hear about before, right? Because I sort of woke up with the idea, or grew up with the idea, that the U.S. had gone into Iraq against UN advice, without UN support, and I wasn't really sure why. And so this is interesting. Okay. All right. So critics of President George Bush Sr. argue that he was too sensitive to the wishes of the international community when he failed to follow the UN-authorized expulsion of Iraq from Kuwait with an invasion of Iraq and a change of regime in Baghdad. 12 years later, critics of President George Bush Jr. argue just the opposite, that he was too heedless of the wishes of the international community when he ordered, without explicit UN authorization, the invasion of Iraq and the overthrow of Saddam Hussein. In their view, the French government was consistently right in arguing for a multilateral approach to Iraq. Yet this is in many ways a false dichotomy, it says. And I find that interesting in that, look, no matter what you do, someone is going to criticize you. It doesn't matter if you make the best possible choice. Someone is going to criticize you. Someone is going to say you did something wrong. And especially those who don't like you are going to use whatever criticism they can take in order to sort of drag you down on a political level, right? It doesn't matter what on earth the U.S. does. Putin's going to stand there and say that whatever they did was wrong. Even if, Putin was arguing for the U.S. to do exactly that thing, and they do it, the next day that's all forgotten. The U.S. did something bad, right? Because the U.S. is seen as an enemy of his regime. It's the same in regular politics, right? In city politics, in state politics, in federal politics. If that's your enemy, then whatever they did is wrong. Doesn't matter if you were arguing for them or against them, right? You're trying to win points. You're trying to win elections. You're trying to lower their power base. And so whatever they said is wrong. And this is sort of what we see here, right? In what it points out that, okay, well, you should have gone into Iraq. You shouldn't have gone into Iraq. It doesn't really matter what you should or should not have done. There's no correct answer, really. There's just whose side are you on? There's just what do you want to happen? There's just the outcome you're looking for. And it can be interesting what can happen, right? Because you could be, as a state, actually in favor of the U.S. invading Iraq. But that does not mean you can say you are in favor of the U.S. invading Iraq. It might not play well to your political base. You might be in trouble because you supported a regime that your people hate. Or you supported the U.S. and people use that as a way of attacking you. Or you voted one way on a UN resolution, and this time you voted a different way, and people will attack you for that. Or you voted against a country that they like or they're a part of, and they'll attack you for that. Or you voted for a country that they don't like, and they'll attack you for that, right? It doesn't matter what you do, something as bad is going to happen. But there is such a thing as a political norm in a country, right? The expected talking points. If today someone comes out and says, like, oh, we need to get rid of all Social Security. It's a bad idea. Right? Then you can't say that. There probably are factions in the government who are in favor of that, but they're not getting elected if they say that. So they have to go be hypocritical. They have to, well, we're not really in favor of that. Well, yes, you are. You just don't have the cojones to say it. Right? You just know that if you say it out loud, people won't feel it's right. There are folk who are totally racist, and yet if they come out and say, "Oh, I really don't think a black man should be president," well, that idea has been regarded as illegitimate, so they got to come up with something else. Even though there may be this idea behind them, they don't use that. They use code words. They use suggestions. It can also be that you are in favor of somebody doing something, but you don't want to do it yourself. We see this, for example, in the United States today, with the Republicans don't condemn something that Trump does, but they don't support it either. They just sort of stand back and say, well, we aren't going to say yes or no about it. And that is implicit agreement, right? That is saying, well, Congress has the power to stop this, or Congress has the power to decide to pull back this ability of the president to do taxes or tariffs or to fire this person or that person. But Congress isn't going to say outright, we support this. The president absolutely has this power. Congress is just going to be dysfunctional. And oh my gosh, too bad, so sad. You have all these actions being taken, and if only we could get ourselves together in order to stop them. But unfortunately, we couldn't. I know it's a tragedy, really. Right? And so you're never really sure, as someone watching from the outside, what is actually going on inside a person's head. Why are they doing this or that? Why are they arguing this or that? Are they saying something in public that not saying in private? Right? Are they trying to gain kudos for their political movement while actually thinking that whatever this country does is good? And you can be very short-sighted in that, right? You might say, well, country A is doing something that I think country A should be doing, but I can't say that because of my politics. So I'm going to say country A is doing something bad. At the same time, I'm like signing orders for $10 million worth of guns to be sold to them. Right. At the same time, I'm signing mutual defense agreements. I'm saying, well, they shouldn't have done that thing that they did. Right? Or you might be upset by what they did, but you aren't really upset enough to take actions that stop them. It's just voices. And you don't think you're doing any harm, really. You think you're just focused on your own central area. You're defending your own position. You're defending your own voters' preferences, like what they want to hear. Although you're probably thinking voters are dumb. And if I'm a country and there is some politician in a different country ragging on me, what's more important, what they do or what they say, It's like if, Israel's always a target, right? You can say the French government says Israel is doing something bad here, but then they also sent them, $15 billion worth of arms deals or something. And you're like, okay, if you're Israel, you're like, I don't care what the French government says. They're going to vote. You have a bunch of people voting in the UN, but if the US on the Security Council votes negative, then it doesn't matter where all those other people vote. And so France is free to vote whatever it wants. All right, it's free to vote negatively because it knows the US is going to have the opposite viewpoint. And yet, what is a country like is Israel focused on? Not UN support, but French guns or English guns or Japanese guns or American guns or Mexican guns. I don't know. It could be as simple as building materials or trade or lowering of tariff barriers, right? And I could say the same thing about China, for example. There's all sorts of countries ragging on China all the time, but they're perfectly happy to do business with it. They're perfectly happy to hand wave some minor discrepancies in, let's say, subsidies of electronic car manufacturers, because there's something else to win. You know, not going to hold them to every single line on every single page of the agreement, just mostly. And it's the same with the U.S. Hey, if the U.S. comes in and says, well, I know we made an agreement with you about the NAFTA, right? But actually, I'm going to rip that whole agreement up, and we're going to make a new agreement, and it's going to be better for me. Well, you acquiesce, right? You go, okay, do I want to fight against the U.S. when they're taking advantage of this and breaking their word and whatnot, or I just want to go along with it? You know, acquiesce to this in the new political reality. So it's sort of unclear. Okay. And so this is interesting, right? The invasion of Iraq in 2003 was not without a legitimate basis in international law and was supported in various ways by 40 other states. No country was so opposed to the regime change that was willing to fight against it other than with at least expensive and effective of weapons rhetoric. On the other side, and then he criticizes the French government. The French government can hardly be portrayed as an exemplar of multilateral virtue, even more than the UN Security Council can be regarded as a sole fount of legitimacy in international relations. The crisis in Iraq arose from deep ambiguities in the way the UN, and especially the Security Council, had behaved in the 13 years prior to 2003. Okay. Those who today exalt the United Nations and execrate the United States have selective memories. For the cardinal sins of omission on the part of the former far outweigh the venal sins of commission on the part of the latter. Basically, the UN couldn't actually make up its mind about what to do about Iraq, is my understanding of the case. There were numerous sanctions. There were numerous calls for nuclear inspectors and chemical weapons inspectors to be sent to Iraq that Saddam denied throughout the country and so on. And the UN was just like, well, that's bad, and that's bad. You know, there were condemnations of Iraq for supporting terrorism. The UN was like, you shouldn't do that. But wasn't actually going to do anything about it, right? There were a few economic sanctions, but there was no support for military intervention. Because honestly, if you're the UN, if you're a member of the UN, you're one of these countries that does not have an army, or one of these countries like Iraq that has an army, but you know it sucks, then do you want the precedent of the UN arguing for the overthrow of a country? If you're Georgia or Turkey or Saudi Arabia or Egypt or the Congo or Ghana or Colombia or Venezuela or Thailand, you know, whatever country you may be anywhere on the planet, do you want there to be such a precedent that the UN says every country on the UN board, every country on earth can invade this country and overthrow its government because it's illegitimate or it's supporting terrorism? You have to ask yourself, okay, this is a slippery slope. If they can invade Iraq for this, can they invade Iran for this thing? They can invade Iran. Can they invade Saudi Arabia? If they can invade Saudi Arabia, can they invade Egypt? If they can invade Egypt, then can they invade Greece? If they can invade Greece, can they invade Ukraine or Chile, right? Maybe we happen to elect a dictator in the United States. Can they invade the United States? Maybe we have massive civil rights violations in Bangladesh. Can they invade Bangladesh? Is that a big enough reason for them to do it? Who knows? But if we say, no one invades another country like this. No one overthrows them. It's not like it's not like Iraq is a failed state, just a dictator state. And you're asking yourself also, okay, so Iraq supports terrorism, okay? Is the threat of Iraqi terrorism strong enough to you that you would advocate for the overthrow of a state? Now, how much trouble is it if an Islamic terrorist blows up a bar in your city every year? How much trouble is it really if there's a gas attack? How much difficulty, how much danger is there to your government, to your way of life, if someone flies a plane into a farmhouse, or someone blows up a truck in front of Parliament? I mean, that's dangerous. People might die, but if you invade Iraq, that's a whole lot of other people dying, right? It's a whole lot of money, a whole lot of time, it's a whole lot of risk going to war over this. You're asking, okay, how big is it? How big of this is a problem? Like, one of the interesting things about terrorism is you have large terrorist attacks in Europe decades before you have 9/11 in the US. And then the US is the country who 9/11 happened to, and then reacted, going, okay, we're going to hit whoever on earth these people are. You know, there is a debate over how much of it is Saudi Arabia, how much of it is Afghanistan. Should they have gone into Iraq? You know, were they chasing the Taliban in there? Were they focus on attacking all of terrorism? If you have the 40 countries, the coalition, the willing, that are supporting them, and no one really stood in their way. It was just words in the UN. Nothing was actually going to stop the US from invading. It just sounds good to your local market, because the US is the big bad guy. You know, the UN could have made up its mind. The UN could have said invade Iraq, or the UN could have said we're going to reverse all our sanctions, but they didn't. And when the US moved in, my understanding of it is, at least, is the US attempted to get UN support. The US was using UN resolutions in order to legitimize its invasion of Iraq. That is, it was going to happen anyway, sort of the bit. But it was the reason it was able to happen, or the reason it was able to happen is not just that US decided to do it, but that the UN had pushed in that direction very hesitantly for several years. Right. And then it talks about the United Nations in general. Right. Such checks on the power of the United States as exist today must therefore be sought behind the veil of multilateralism. You know, they'll be found in the permanent overrepresentation in the UN Security Council of Britain, France, Russia, and China. It is they, not the UN per se, that have the power to deny the foreign policy of the United States the sanction of the international community in the form of UNSC resolutions. Thus, this is interesting, right? And they can exercise this power singly as well as collectively. Thus, ironically, the seal of multilateral approval can be withheld by the unilateral action of just one other permanent member of the Security Council. China can say the UN does not vote for this to happen, for this military adventure to happen, right? And you may have every other country in the UN, hypothetically, in favor of it, but China is on the Security Council. Hey, look at Israel. The US is on the Security Council. Russia is on the Security Council, right? Why is there no UN movement for defending Ukraine? Russia's on the Security Council. You literally cannot do it. This is part of the reason why the Cold War was a Cold War, right? The Soviet Union and the United States, both on the Security Council, and if you want to declare a world war, you want the support of the UN, because the US, for all its vaunted power, was not going to invade the Soviet Union single-handedly. It needs support. It needs, at the very least, permission to establish bases in places like Germany and Turkey. So you need that multinational support. And you literally cannot get it if the Soviet Union stands in its way. You literally can't get that support. So what do you do if you want to invade the Soviet Union? You have to essentially dissolve the UN. You have to leave it. You have to say we're moving beyond the UN and we are either ignoring it or we're creating a new one without a Security Council or without Russia or without the Soviet Union in it, right? And that's legally. Now, you can, of course, do that, but it's another step. It's another tie down on the power of these super majors. Today, the US is really the focus of this because it is the remaining superpower, right? Because it is the one with bases in 100 countries, because it can invade and interfere and does interfere everywhere. But the alternatives are either nobody interferes anywhere, or you have a bunch of little groups who interfere, right? Southeast Asia decides to interfere in Malaysia. All the Southeast Asian, right? All of Europe decides to interfere in Morocco. All of the United States decides to interfere in Venezuela. Right? You had these sort of actions by individuals, and there's no group, there's no organization. You go back to the way the world was before. At least this is my understanding. Like right now, I'm arguing the U.S.'s side in this because of the book I'm reading. The other side is a little more complicated because it evidences a large number of viewpoints, right? Like, say you are talking about the war in Ukraine today, okay? There may be countries in favor of it. In favor of supporting Ukrainian defense, right? Because they're in Europe, like Latvia is in favor of supporting Ukrainian defense because they don't need Russia even closer to their border with even larger weapons without any fighters standing in the way. Latvia is looking at the invasion of Ukraine and going, great, we're going to be next if we let this go through. Right now, Russia's concerned with Ukraine, but let them conquer it, give them 10 years, and we're the next bite taken out. We're the next cookie slice taken out of NATO. Whereas if you are South Africa, for example, you're looking at this and going, I don't care about the invasion of Ukraine because it's not a danger to me, right? Russia could invade Ukraine, and how long would it take Russia to get down to South Africa if it continued conquering places? 800 years, if then, right? And so you can be in favor of Russia's invasion. You can support Russia's invasion if you're South Africa because it's not a danger to you. In the same way, you can literally be in Europe, and this is the strange part to me, right? You can be one of those places in Europe that doesn't feel the automatic threat. And God, there's one of it. I want to say it's like Hungary. I think it's Hungary. It might be the Czech Republic. I get. I'm a little. I get the map of Central Europe a little confused sometimes. But say you're Hungary and you don't actually have a border straight up with Russia. So you're thinking, okay, so Russia can take Ukraine, but that doesn't mean they're going to be a threat to my country or my power. And besides, I'm in charge and I'll probably be dead by the time that actually comes to fruition. But in the meantime, Russia gives me a lot of support, monetarily wise. Or in the meantime, there are people in my country who are anti-war, and this gets them to vote for me because I'm anti-war. Even though, I would argue any sensible person in Europe or looking at European history would look at Russia's invasion of Ukraine and go, it's just a matter of time until Russia expands again into their country. I don't care if it's Ireland. Do you want to fight now or in 200 years? But, that's, again, my own central idea. Okay, then the invasion of Kuwait, which we won, especially, so on and so on. And then U.S. Okay, when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait in August 2nd, 1990, he did so at one of the rare moments in history when the UN Security Council was in a position to give more or less unqualified support to an action the United States would certainly have carried out anyway. Right? So Kuwait was one of those interesting bits. And the Balkans was also another interesting bit, right? Where there was no major power at stake. No one of the major empires, no one of the people on the UN Security Council had a stake really in what happened to Iraq or what happened in the Balkans. Okay, that is, it was going to be chaos no matter what. So they're just thinking, okay, the U.S. goes in and it gets involved in this chaos, right? But Russia doesn't want to take advantage. Russia isn't like thinking we're going to take advantage of the chaos in Iraq. It's a little far away from home. They pull a few bits out of it, but it's like the fall of Iraq isn't going to affect them negatively very much. Same with China, same with France, same with England, right? They just don't have a lot of interest in Iraq staying. So they may as well watch it, go, right? They may as well go through and defend Kuwait. Keep the oil flowing for everybody. So they say yes. Okay. But here we go. So like he says 5 points are worth emphasizing. One, the first and most obvious is that with the Soviet Union in its death throes, the traditional obstacle to American policy in the Security Council vanished, and so on, because the Soviet Union would have had an interest in Iraq as a place in the Middle East it was trying to expand its power to. But because the Soviet Union was falling apart during this time, all of a sudden that interest disappears. Okay. And secondly, Saddam underestimated the American determination to kick the Vietnam syndrome once and for all. America wanted to win a war. Okay. The third point, however, was that precisely for fear of the Vietnam syndrome, the United States did not press home its advantage by invading Iraq itself. As chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Colin Powell urged Bush to stop the ground war, allowing at least half of Saddam's loyal Republican Guard to escape. Having incited rebellions against Saddam's regime by Kurds in the north and Shia Muslims in the south of the country, the United States stood aside as these were crushed. The most that was done in the aftermath of victory was to impose first a security zone for the Kurds in northern Iraq, and later 2 no-fly zones north of the 36th parallel and south of the 32nd. Then the United States continued to hope for Saddam's demise. It launched a missile. It enforced the UN resolutions limiting Iraq's post-war military activities. There were further cruise missile strikes in 1996, again in December 1998, prompted by Iraq's refusal to cooperate with UN Special Commission's weapons inspectors, and so on. So basically what this book is saying is that America wanted to win a war, went in to Kuwait, Desert Storm, bing, bada, boom, we win. Victory achieved. But Vietnam, that is in order to sort of expunge the memory of Vietnam, right? We lost the last war, we're going to win the next one. But also because of the memory of Vietnam, the U.S. looked at this and says, well, we don't want to invade Iraq because then we'll have to deal with Iraq. Then we're going to be stuck there. Much, much easier to just do desert war, beat the hell out of them, get out. And the claims that this is a mistake, but the claim also is interesting. It says that, there were a rebellion, so the idea was that maybe Iraq would fall apart in itself, Saddam would be weakened, but the U.S. doesn't go in and push overmuch for that to happen, which is interesting because that is a entirely different action than the United States has taken for most of its existence. For most of its existence, as far as I can tell in this book, the U.S. is ready and willing to send in the Marines, right? Ready and willing to launch a few missiles to do a little invading in order to push a regime over the edge into insolvency. But I think one of the sort of problems that arose here is that it wasn't entirely clear who the U.S. wanted to win, right? I mean, for example, having incited rebellions against Saddam's regime by Kurds in the north, well, it turns out that Kurdistan, as a pseudo idea nation, right, also has rebellions that tend to be ongoing in Iran and Turkey, Syria as well, I think. Yeah, Iran, Iraq, Syria, Turkey. And none of those other countries wants a Kurdish state to form, because then that Kurdish state would push its tendrils into their area, into their Kurds, and so on and so on. So all those people are against it. All those states are against it if there's a Kurdish rebellion. And as for a Shia rebellion, well, then you're dealing with you're dealing with Iran, right? As sort of the pusher mover there, as what I would think, like the state who would benefit from it. Sort of interesting. Okay. And then it says, in many ways, the first Gulf War had greater consequences outside Iraq than inside it, right? So nothing really changed inside Iraq after Desert Storm, but outside, okay, even after the war had been won, U.S. forces were not wholly withdrawn from the Middle East. On the contrary, in the 1990s, the number stationed there increased from 6,000 in 1993 to 16,000 by the year 2000. This represented a tripling of the U.S. military commitment to the region. Especially remarkable was a rising number of American personnel stationed in Saudi Arabia, temporary tenants of the royal dynasty that happened to be accompanied by between 100 and 200 warplanes. These figures understate the extent of the American presence because they do not take account of the number of U.S. naval vessels deployed in and around the Gulf. Nor do they capture another aspect of the growing Saudi military dependency. The Saudi regime between 1990 and 1992 placed orders worth more than $25 billion with U.S. armaments manufacturers. In effect, the Arabian political system, with its exceptionally low military participation rate, made Riyadh dependent for its security on American manpower and firepower. As we've seen, however, this only served to fuel the resentments of the radical Islamic movement inside and outside Saudi Arabia. So the U.S., after Desert Storm, increases its presence in the Middle East because all these countries, Saudi Arabia especially, is feeling very vulnerable, right? Is feeling, okay, we have Iraq, who did launch an invasion, and who knows what could be next. So we need some more armaments. Right? We want a stronger U.S. presence here to deter any ongoing troubles, whether it be from Iran or Egypt or Yemen or who knows, or I don't know, India with its navy, who knows. But this means that American troops and American support for various regimes in the Middle East is now more apparent and obvious. And this gets Bin Laden going. Again, I think it's kind of dumb, right? It's like if he, disgusted by the Saudis' authorities' reliance on American protection, they had declined his offer to lead an Afghan-style guerrilla force against Saddam. Bin Laden left Saudi Arabia in April 1991. And like, if you didn't like Saudi Arabia, like, why are you attacking the UN? Did it just morph into the idea of attacking the U.S.? I don't know. and there's probably lots of books on how Al-Qaeda works and so on, like the rationale for attacking the U.S. instead of focusing your attacks on the countries that you don't like, or perhaps part of it, we go back to that book on interviewing terrorists, and one thing that it said, I remember, is that in these countries you don't have political representation, you don't have political movements. If you don't like what your country is doing, like in Saudi Arabia, if you don't like what Saudi Arabia is doing and you're a citizen, good luck changing anything. You'd have to overthrow the entire system in order to get something done, right? And if you do try to change something, you're liable to be thrown in jail for saying the wrong thing at the wrong time. As such, if you seek political change, you end up doing it through religious means or violent means, because you do not have that pressure release of thinking that you can change things by words. You only think I can change things by actions. And so I think when you do that, you probably start eventually just hitting back against everybody. It's not about who do I want to hit. It's more about who can I hit? Who can I blame for this? Says the fifth and final feature of the first Gulf War also had little to do with Iraq. This is what might be described as marginalization of Israel. The Bush administration took the view that Israel should not serve as the center of military operations against Iraq. When Saddam fired Scud missiles at Tel Aviv, the Americans worked energetically to prevent any Israeli retaliation. American loan guarantees were $10 billion were allowed to lapse when the Israelis refused to accept conditions the United States attached to them. After 1991, American aid to Israel was effectively frozen and in real terms declined. Basically, the Americans gave less money to Israel. But again, still supported them militarily. Still, that idea of defense. So if you aren't willing to walk away from a contract, no matter what, then the other side is going to push and push and push and push on the terms of that contract, because they know you won't actually leave. So you don't have any actual power over them. You can just sort of suggest things. You can pressure, but not you can't force them to do anything. And this is one of the one of the benefits and the weaknesses of the American system, I think, is that the U.S. has a lot of footholds, a lot of fingerholds places, but it doesn't really have a boot on the neck of a lot. Right? A lot of U.S. allies, you can suggest they move in a certain way, but the alliance takes a very long time to fail because it is based on militarily advantageous relations. Right? Like, if you are South Korea, you are not leaving the U.S. alliance, no matter what. Because you're staring at North Korea and you're going, I don't need all this danger. The U.S. leaves, and all of a sudden, South Korea is a very small, very vulnerable country. Same with Taiwan. If the U.S. leaves, all of a sudden Taiwan is a very small, very vulnerable country. And so you're not leaving. And so this means that the United States is going to push and push and push. But the U.S. also needs South Korea and Taiwan and Japan and the Philippines as part of its containment against China. So it's not going to leave either. And that is a more equitable relation, I think. It's unclear in the Middle East exactly why it's the same. And internal politics come into it, I think. Okay. Oh, then it talks about Black Hawk Down fiasco in Somalia. Clinton's response So Black Hawk Down, there was a Black Hawk helicopter shot down in Mogadishu, in Somalia, and lots of death and destruction, and so on and so on. Right, 18 American soldiers died, and a bunch of unarmed Somali men, women, and children also died in the middle of this firefight between the Rangers and the people who were attacking them. And then it says here, Clinton's response took a form that has been characteristic of many American interventions before and since. He increased the number of troops, but at the same time he specified a date for their departure, just 6 months later. The problem with this approach hardly needs to be spelled out. The certainty that American forces would soon be gone removed any incentive on the part of Somali warlords to mend their ways. All you got to do is keep your head down for a couple months and the Americans leave. That's the sort of the message of this book, right? 6 months later, the United States handed over responsibility to a UN mission, leaving only a few hundred men on the island, and allowing Aristide, the dictator. Oh, this is in Haiti. Yeah. Something very similar in 1994 when the Clinton administration, once again acting under UNSC resolution, sent 20,000 troops to Haiti to restore the elected president, Aristide, who had been ousted by the military 3 years before. 6 months later, the U.S. left, allowing Aristide to resume the normal operation of Haiti politics, theft, murder, intimidation, and corruption. So U.S. goes in, U.S. beats the bad guy up, U.S. gets out. U.S. goes in, beats the bad guy up, U.S. goes out. And what happens when this event takes place? You go in, you beat someone else, and you leave, and now there's a power vacuum. And what do power vacuums cause? Damage. Right? And if you're involved in 1994, what is this, right? If you're still doing the stupidity where you go in and you're supporting a dictator because they're positive for your side, then all you're doing is saying, well, that dictator isn't actually strong enough by themselves to keep themselves in power. And so that means you're going to have lots of trouble. I think there is something to be said for keeping a democracy in power, but it has to be a functioning democracy. And if a democracy is falling apart, right, isn't able to keep itself going, then it happens for one of two reasons. Either it's an internal problem, right? There you have a democracy that is controlled by one tribe or one family, right? And this creates an instability because of a narrowing power base, which eventually the entire thing topples over and you have a civil war. Okay. And I would say you should not support these dictators, or you should not support those democracies. Because if they aren't strong enough to survive on their own without outside interference, then they're probably not going to be very stable for very long, right? You're going to be constantly fighting against the force that keeps them going. On the other hand, if you have a functioning democracy that is unstable because of outside forces, you have something else going on. This, as I understand it, this is Lebanon. So you have the legitimate Lebanese government in the north of Lebanon, and you have Hezbollah in the south of Lebanon. And so Hezbollah's army is bigger than that of Lebanon itself. And so the Lebanese government says it has power, but really Hezbollah has much of the strength, right? Like when Israel recently launched another war into Lebanon, against Hezbollah, as I understand it, the Lebanese government was very happy about this because it got Hezbollah off their back. Because one thing about something like Hezbollah, right, is that it can act as a government without the responsibility of government. It's the same in like Hamas, right? You can say, oh, we have the guns, we have the money, we have the power, but also we don't control the electricity. We are not the elected official. And so it's their job to do things. And if something is wrong, if there's not enough power, electricity, or water, or there's corruption, well, the legitimate government should fix it, not us. We aren't the government. But then the legitimate government comes in and tries to fix it, and all of a sudden Hezbollah is like, no, get the hell out, this is our territory. And you have hypocrisy going on. Okay. And Hezbollah is supported by Iran. So what you actually have is the legitimate government of Lebanon being destabilized by Iranian activity. Well, and Israeli activity sometimes as well. Isn't really helping. And you have Syria up to north of that, which is not helping on the right. Very precarious position, but just looking at that specific dichotomy, I understand you have a Lebanese government that is being pushed to become more unstable by Iranian activity. Because Iran ends up supporting Hezbollah militarily and economically. And in that case, I would say then that you have, as a government, a legitimate reason to step in for power reasons, right? If you can say, look, Russia is interfering in an election in Ukraine or an election in Georgia, then you go, okay, so it's not that the democracy doesn't work. It's not that the people don't have a viewpoint. It's not that there is a civil war going on and we're not really sure who to ally with. It's not that there is an instability or a problem with that. It's that a problem is being created and being taken advantage of. So what you're actually dealing with here is an invasion, is an indirect invasion. Right? It is Iran trying to take over Lebanon while hiding behind the veil of not being Lebanon. Right? Is Russia trying to take over Georgia or parts of Georgia while saying at the same time, we aren't actually Georgia. We just want influence. We just want a sphere of control. And it gets interesting, right? Because you look at a state like Afghanistan, and you're going to have countries trying to influence, Iran, Pakistan, India, China. These are all going to try to influence Afghanistan in some way. And the state of Afghanistan itself is unstable enough for this to take place. Yet you cannot, at the same time, keep it going, right? The U.S. was not able to create Afghanistan, was not able to keep Afghanistan going because of its own internal problems and outside support. So it gets rather complicated who you should support or should not support. And I'm just using examples from present day where I know something about the situation. If you start talking to me about Nigeria or South Africa or Morocco or Libya, then my knowledge of what's going on kind of goes out the window. Like in Venezuela or Colombia, I'm vaguely aware of what's going on, but not as much as I perhaps should be, I think. And it becomes very hard to sort of understand if the U.S. is a source of stability or a source of instability, because you see both things happening. You see international order, you see international aid organizations, you see international law that the U.S. is pushing. You see the freedom of the seas. You see the U.S. has a ton of military bases where it is supporting various governments and keeping them from falling or faltering or helping them to deal with terrorists or drug runners or something. But you also have the U.S. upholding places that are unstable. Or you have the U.S. overthrowing places. And you're going, well, was I, like, should we have overthrown Iraq? Are the people of Iraq better off today than they were? Is the world safer than it was? And there could be many, many views on this. But as with any war, it becomes very difficult to have a legitimate moral argument because you're going, oh my God, look at the 20 million people who died. Look at the mothers and children's and weddings and halls filled with the dead and the dying and the tortured and the limbs who have been lost. Look at the money we spent. Here's a map of, drone strikes over the past 12 years, and there's like 14,000 of them or something. You're going, well, is it worth it? And you can go back to any war. You can go back to the American War of Independence and go, was the War of Independence worth it? Lots of people died. And we want to say it was, but how much is one life worth? At the same time, you have the counterfactual. What if that had not happened? What would have gone on? It's like in the Civil War. You can say, well, we ended up with the Civil War, and that was good because slavery was defeated, and the descendants of slaves today live better lives, and it was worth it. But the fact is, lots of people at that time died. There are family lines that would not exist today. Either way you go, either because they're slave descendant or because they're descended from somebody who died in the Civil War, right? How do you justify saying, well, those people died and it was fine? It's one thing to say that in the past. It's a whole nother idea to look at something that happened during my lifetime, right? Look at something that is done by a government that I pay taxes to and voted for. Or I'm going, okay, was that death that the U.S. caused for the better? And who am I to say that this person or that person should have died? But I'm also aware that at least some of the people that the U.S. killed during its war on terror would gladly have shot me on sight, would gladly have looked at me and gone, you're an American, I'm going to kill you. And I would be like, I didn't do, as far as I know, didn't do anything directly to you. Like, I don't even understand what you're saying or why you're angry, really. Oh, then it talks about genocides. Oh, gosh. Okay, so the UN General Assembly unanimously passed a resolution condemning genocide in 1946. Right, but the U.S. refused to ratify the convention until 1985. Harbert and Relis still argued that the UN Convention ought not to be ratified since it would tend to enhance the standing of the International Court of Justice. Then Jimmy Carter, 1979, we must forge an unshakable oath with all civilized people that never again will the world fail to act in time to prevent this terrible crime of genocide. Ronald Reagan, never again. Bill Clinton, 1993, opens a Holocaust Museum in Washington. We must not permit this to happen again. And it goes on. Unfortunately, never again turned out in the 1990s to mean no more than once or twice a decade. Then it goes on to the disintegration of the multi-ethnic Yugoslav Federation, 12 territorial fragments. Then it talks about between the Serbs and the Croatians to partition Bosnia. Then you have Bosnian Serbs proclaim their independent republic, centered on Pale, begin their attacks in Sarajevo. Although atrocities against civilians were perpetuated by all three sides of the conflict, there was from an early stage evidence that most of the genocidal acts were the responsibility of the Serbian authorities in Pale and their masters in Belgrade. Then there was Srebrenica. And here was genocide. Where was the United Nations? The answer is that it was right there. Indeed, with grotesque irony, its forces effectively presided over the worst of the genocidal atrocities. Right? Okay, so peacekeeping forces were sent to Croatia and Bosnia. Specified towns were designated as safe areas. At the same time, the UN imposed sanctions on the whole of Yugoslavia, including Bosnia, a circumstance that greatly handicapped the Bosnian Muslims, who had no significant internal source of arms and other supplies. The Bosnian Serbs, by contrast, received substantial assistance from Belgrade. It is important to recollect that much of the responsibility for this woefully ill-conceived response lay with the European powers that had proclaimed their ability to cope with the Yugoslav crisis without American assistance. Supposedly, this was to be the hour of Europe, but Europe, as usual, spoke with multiple voices. A German foreign minister who accelerated the disintegration of the Yugoslav Federation by his precipitate recognition of Slovenian and Croatian independence. The British government dropped a posture of studious, not to say shameless, neutrality, insisting as the conflict escalated that it was a civil war between morally equivalent forces, obsessed with their own ancient hatreds. Successive British foreign secretaries willfully ignored the evidence of a sustained campaign by Milosevic to whip up murderous nationalisms among the Serbs, and instead concentrated on blocking any effective intervention by anyone. The Bush administration had contemplated a sort of mini-Iraq thing as early as the winter of 1991, drawing up contingency plans for military strike against the Serbs. It was decided instead to take the Europeans at their word. Then you had Defense Secretary William Cohen, who unwittingly gave a green light to Serbian attacks in Gorazad when he declared that the United States would not enter the war to avert its fall. American indignation took time to overcome European appeasement, however. In May 1993, the British government smothered American proposals to lift sanctions and launch airstrikes against the Serbs. In November the following year, the Foreign Office protested indignantly when the U.S. unilaterally ceased to enforce the arms embargo. American planes flew supplies of medicine to Sarajevo and enforced the UN-authorized no-fly zone, as if ethnic cleansing were being carried out from fighter planes, but airstrikes against Serb positions were opposed by the British. It took an atrocity on the scale of the massacre at Srebrenica, a town supposedly under the protection of Dutch blue helmets, to tip the balance belatedly in favor of American intervention. Then the United States insists that NATO bombs the Serbs in earnest, and so on and so on. Okay. The institutional framework within which American policy over Bosnia involved was bewildering in its complexity. The UN and NATO had a voice. The Conference for Security and Cooperation in Europe, the Council of Europe, the West European Union. Yet the overwhelming impression remains that if one institution got it completely wrong in Bosnia, it was the United Nations. And its failures were in large measure a result of the conduct of two permanent members of the Security Council, Britain and France. In the end, the Dayton Accords drawn up and forced upon the recalcitrant Serbs were the work of none of these august bodies, but of an informal contact group composed of the US, Britain, France, Germany, and Russia, the 19th century great powers doing business as of old. With sublime insistence, the French foreign minister still insisted one cannot call it an American peace. The reality was very different. It was the threat of American airstrikes that forced the Serbs to accept a smaller share of the partitioned Bosnia. It was the presence of 20,000 American troops, a third of the implementation force, that ensured they did not renege on the agreement. Right, so in 2003, the simple fact seemed to be generally forgotten. There was no United Nations approval for a NATO war against Serbia. Only after the war, on June 10th, the day after Milosevic surrendered, the UNSC provided a resolution. And so the events in the Balkans are something that I vaguely remember hearing of, and I know almost nothing about it. So everything I say is coming almost entirely from this, except that I did visit North Macedonia once, and there was a museum I went to. It was a while ago, but it was just like horrible massacres over and over. Horrible massacres, which is like the story of these people died, and these people died, and these people died, and here's a mass grave, and there's a mass grave, and here's some pictures, and there's some limbs hacked off them. It was horrid, right? But from the outside, you're looking and you're going, okay, there's a bunch of folk fighting each other. I don't really know why they're fighting. I don't know why they hate each other. Is it political? Is it ethnic? Is it some historical thing? Is it because of outside support? Is it because of internal discrepancies? I don't know what's going on. And what the book is trying to point out here is that multilateralism can be surprisingly ineffective. Okay? If a single power wants to go in and says, this is wrong, I want to do something about it, then they go in and they do it. If you have to have 20 or 30 or just even 5 or 10 groups of people, states agree to an intervention, then what is going to happen? Either they're going to come to no agreement, then you'll argue back and forth over tiny bits of information that don't really matter, or they are going to come to an agreement that is very anemic, very weak. We're going to put some blue helmets here, and so on. I remember reading a story once that really stuck with me. It was, I don't recall exactly which country it was at, but it was somewhere in Africa, and it had to do with a UN security force soldier, a UN peacekeeping soldier, who the UN had set up this safe area for civilians. Okay? And so this soldier is in the middle of the night, essentially, standing here enforcing a barrier. And you have 2 military groups fighting that he can see. Like he's literally standing on a hill looking down into this valley, and there's 2 military groups fighting. And his job is to say, this is where the UN has established a safe zone. And he's looking out at this, and people are running past him. Like there are civilians, mothers with carrying their children, running past him, trying to get into the UN safe zone. And he's standing there with his rifle. He's looking at this battle, and someone starts running towards him. One of the people that's going to pass him. He sees him, and then they are shot. Like it's like a mother or a child, right? And there is shot, maybe 20 feet from him. And the soldier standing there is going, I cannot help this person. I have been given very strict orders to enforce this security zone. Right? The UN has an agreement with these fighting forces that they will not attack UN forces, and the UN will not attack them. And I'm just here to hold the safe zone. But he's staring at this, and this is some genocide, some massacre going on. Gal runs up, is shot in the back, and she's lying there, not quite dead. So the soldiers that shot her come up, put their gun to their head, shoot her point blank, look at this UN soldier in the eye and smile and laugh and point at him, then they walk away. And the UN soldier is just standing here like, what the hell am I doing? We can condemn this genocide that's going on, but we aren't actually willing to do anything to stop it. We set up a safe zone, right? We say we're going to protect people here. We have a few hundred military troops sitting around, and we're just letting civilians be killed by the thousands. And this, I've heard also, UN food trucks can head into an area, and maybe 5% of that food actually makes it to the people you're trying to feed, because 95% of it is taken by the armies who are fighting. And so you drive in with your UN food, and you know almost nothing that you do is going to help the people who are starving. The food is going to be used to feed the soldiers, or it's going to be sold on the international market for money for these armies. And like, it's the problem of, you can condemn an action, you can say genocide is bad, but if you aren't willing to actually do something about it, if you aren't willing to go in and say, well, I'm going to stop this with actual force, or the threat here of airstrikes. If you have a couple hundred peacekeeping soldiers as sort of a tripwire, then that does something, right? That protects somebody, but it doesn't stop the fighting. It's a half-assed condemnation, saying this is bad, but not bad enough for me to stop it. Not bad enough for me to spend my resources. Not bad enough for me to interfere in someone else's affairs. Not bad enough for me to start arguing with Britain or France or Russia or China about whether I should or should not do this thing. And it's hard to conceptualize in a way. You can say the world is full of gray, good and bad. It's all mixed up together. And that makes sense. But it's entirely separate, or not entirely separate. It is on a different level to say that the actions you take can be morally gray. Right? You can take an action that is not entirely good or bad. You can take an action that does some good and does some bad. In fact, most actions are like this. We like to think that we do good and we do good, or we do good, or these people do bad and they do bad, they do bad. But every action has a reaction. You're inputting energy into a very complex situation, and who will you hurt? Who will you not hurt? How will that butterfly effect result be in 5 days or 10 days or 10 years? Do you solve the problem, or is it an ongoing conflict, a la Israel and Palestine, or Iran and everybody, right? What's the point if you're not solving the issue which causes this problem? What's the point if you're just dealing with the effect of something and hoping that it goes away, hoping that the massacre stops, hoping that people come to their senses, hoping that these tribes that are fighting back and forth just come to an agreement someday? Maybe they do, but I don't think that's the natural state of things. I don't think that is what often happens. I think the fighting goes on and on and on until all of somebody is dead. And I think genocide is much more common than we think it is in history. All right. Superficially, the crises in Yugoslavia and Iraq had much in common. Both were multi-ethnic polities created after World War I. Both had been held together in the 1980s by ruthless dictators guilty of human rights abuses. In both cases, economic sanctions achieved next to nothing. Both had revealed the limits of the United Nations as an entity, and both had showcased the daunting capability of the American military. To some observers in the aftermath of the war against Serbia, there was an obvious conclusion. Serbia and Iraq would continue to be sources of violence and instability as long as they were ruled by Milosevic and Saddam Hussein. Their overthrow was something the United States was capable of effecting, but it might well have to act without the authority of the UN. And then it goes on. She goes on against the UN again, right? Much had been done in the name of humanitarianism in the 1990s. Yet the most disastrous violation of human rights was greeted by the U.S. and the UN with lamentable apathy. This was Rwanda. Those who are sentimentally attached to the United Nations as an institution should be forced to study its abject failure to respond to the ghastly events that unfolded in Rwanda in the mid-1990s, which claimed at least 500,000 lives. It was well known that the Clinton administration's attitude was determined, as usual, by the fear of American casualties. The American insistence that any UN force be kept as small as possible, the American delaying tactics over proposals to send reinforcements, the American assistance that any U.S. troops be paid for by the UN in advance, the American refusal to jam Hutu radio broadcasts. These were acts of shameful negligence. But those who today see the French President Jacques Chirac as the chief of the conscience of the international community should also ponder France's role in this nightmarish episode. For it was France that since the early 1990s had lent military support to the Hutu-dominated government. It was France that conceived the Ugandan intervention in support of the Tutsi Rwandan Patriotic Front as an Anglo-Saxon plot against the Francophone Africa. It was the French who sent troops to create safe areas for Hutus, among them the perpetrators of the massacres in the southwest of the country. And it was the French who objected furiously when the crisis in Rwanda engulfed their client state Zaire, leading to the fall of one of the most egregious tyrants of the post-colonial era, Marshal Mobutu Sese Seko. When Chirac visited New York in the summer of 1995, he disconcerted UN officials by telling them, if you want to find idiotic behavior, you can always count on the Americans. This took some nerve. It's like, this book basically says over and over in many different ways, the French are idiots. Right? This book is not a fan of the French. This book finds the French arrogant and hypocritical. I don't really know enough about French activities to speak clearly on this subject, but from what I have heard, France is also one of those empires that claims it's not an empire. Specifically, I remember watching a video once so France used to have a lot of colonial territory in Africa, then it left. But when it did so, it retained the right to control like the money supply. And so you have several nations in Africa where like their central bank, the money for their central bank is actually held in French banks because of legal reasons, right? French exerts economic control over these areas still. And, I was in Paris. I've been in Paris a few times. And you are struck by the fact that there are a ton of African people there, right? And I think that we in the US, we're used to thinking of France as, these sort of pale-skinned, chain smoking, rioting, fancy cheese-eating folk. But really, France, as I have seen it, it's full of French people, of course, but it also has a lot of Middle Eastern people and a lot of African folk who still have African accents, specifically. And this is something we're not really used to think of. We're not used to thinking of the effect that colonialism still has on how European countries see themselves and act as themselves. There's a reason that France has nuclear weapons. There's a reason that France once left NATO, because it sees itself as a great power still. It wants to be a great power. It wants to still hold influence, while at the same time saying, well, we are not actually colonialists. It's like the British in a way, right? You have still British Commonwealth, and Britain is like, we're not colonialist. We just have interests in areas. And we can say the same about the Chinese or the United States, right? they're not colonialists. They just have interest in areas. They just rent bases or ports. It's out of the goodness of our heart that we're building all these train lines and infrastructure. It's out of the goodness of our heart that we are patrolling the waters around your capital city, or are sending you support, or are giving you $40 billion worth of US dollars as a credit line to keep your economy afloat, right? We're not colonialists. We're just sort of helpful. We have interests everywhere. We can't help it that we're rich. And it's interesting again. Is that a positive force or a negative force? Right? Like, I know recently the United States gave a bunch of money to, I want to say, Argentina. And this was to keep that country solvent until the election of its president was completed, because the recently elected president is enacting economic reforms that are desperately needed by that country, and it's getting a bit rocky. So the U.S. supports it by giving money, and it's doing this in order to make friends, but also to achieve stability, right? In order to keep this country going without yet more problems, right? Because the U.S. is already looking at Venezuela and going, gosh, we don't need this issue. The U.S. is already looking at all the drug running problems and going, we don't need more problems. We would like one stable country in South America. I think Brazil and Chile are relatively stable today. But again, it just what he's pointing out here by attacking both the UN and the French and the Americans is that it's very easy for a politician, or very easy for any layperson really, to say, that's the bad guy, that's the good guy. When in reality, it can be much, much more complicated. In reality, you have a long history of interventions by almost every country on the planet that is militarily powerful, or has been militarily powerful in the last 100 years. Britain is everywhere. France is everywhere. China is everywhere. India is everywhere. The US is everywhere. The Soviet Union and Russia are everywhere. You can't go to a place, to a major country on the planet and say, oh my gosh, the powers of the past, the European powers never did anything here. Or, the Cold War never did anything here. Or today, there's no Chinese or US money here. No, there is everywhere. And so to say that one country or another is entirely faultless is, I think, dangerous to do. Especially when you get into a lot of the history. It's like, this guy in the book is talking about everything from, 1980s, 1974, 1980, 1989, 1999, 600th anniversary, 2001, 1991, 1992. There's a lot of history and complications going here. It's not just in one day, one action by one group. No, it is a long source of action. You look at Iraq, for example, and you have multiple UN resolutions over the course of a decade leading up to Iraq. You look at Iraq, and you have Saddam Hussein, for example, kicking nuclear inspectors out of the country. Apparently he wanted the other countries to think that he was making nukes. And if the U.S. is threatening to invade because you're making nukes, then what you do is you open up your borders and you say, I go to the UN, bring in the inspectors in, I will prove I don't have nukes, right? Because this, even if it doesn't stop the invasion because they might come with something else, it staves it off for a little bit. If your enemy is going to use a rhetoric against you, then what is the actual cost? Like, what does it cost Saddam Hussein to allow nuclear inspectors into his country? Right? I mean, he must have thought that nobody would invade him if he said he had nukes, no one would invade him, and then he can use that as a buffer zone to actually develop the nukes, or to just bluff and push another country in some way because he might have nukes. This strategic ambiguity, which in my mind is really just a method of cheaping out on your defense. But again, I'm not a military person. I'm more the philosophical idealist. So in my mind, right, how I would defend an area, saying these are my red lines. If you cross them, I will respond with drastic force. And then I just keep those red lines, very, very clear. I don't care, one toe over the line, and I will see it as if you had launched an attack with a navy of 10,000. None of this vague ambiguity, and maybe we'll do it, maybe we won't. And no, this is what I'll do. If you do this, I will do this. And you just keep your word. But again, I am not a state. I am not a person in charge of president. I'm not even some lieutenant on the battlefield somewhere. I'm just a guy in my room. Okay, then the war on terror it's basically a secret war, right? No serried ranks of missiles and tanks, just an ever wider range of cameras. Some hidden in matchboxes, others orbiting in outer space. And there's no existing plan for regime change in Afghanistan. The CIA and Central Command scrambled to put one together. Air power is once used to devastating effect. Then you have CIA operatives and special forces personnel. Right. So instead of large attacks, you have small movements, and this is sort of the modern era of warfare, right? Or at least the 2000 to 2020-ish era of warfare, where you are going into places and you are essentially fighting terrorists who blend into a population. Instead of tanks, you need knowledge. And then it defends the U.S. The book defends the U.S. invasion of Iraq. Says there were many legitimate reasons for UN-authorized war against Saddam Hussein, almost too many. Throughout the 1980s, the Iraqi government had developed biological and chemical weapons and had used the latter against the Kurds, and the Kurds had also attempted to acquire nuclear weapons. The United States set up a resolution charged with ensuring that Iraq's weapons of mass destruction were removed or rendered harmless. Until this had been done, an embargo remained in force. From the outset, Saddam frustrated the efforts of the Special Commission. Time and again, Iraqi declarations of what prescribed weapons had been produced turned out to be false. In 1994, the Iraqis ceased to cooperate and allowed the inspectors to resume work only when faced with the threat of military action. This happened again in 1997 when inspectors were banned from specific sites. Cooperation lasted just a few months. So damning was the final report. The U.S. and Britain launched airstrikes against suspected Iraqi WMD facilities. A new inspections team was set up in 1999, but was not allowed into Iraq until November 2002. Then it goes on. Abuses of human rights, sponsorship of terrorist organizations, notably Abu Nidal, contraventions of the conventions on chemical and biological weapons, attempted acquisition of nuclear weapons. The charge sheet against Saddam's regime was long indeed by the beginning of the new century. All that was clearly missing from it was conclusive evidence of involvement in the 9/11 attacks. Saddam had violated 17 UN Security Council resolutions. Then the only mystery is why Iraq was not invaded before 2003. And the book tries to explain its view. The explanation must be sought in the attitude of the other permanent members of the Security Council. It might have been thought that they would have shared the American desire to see Saddam disarmed. Britain did, yet France, Russia, and China all subtly encouraged Iraqi non-compliance with the weapons inspection regimes. By the end of 1999, the chairman of United States Commission on Nuclear Weapons, Richard Butler, was so incensed by the conduct of the other permanent members that he accused them of trying to kill the special commission. Much has been written in the past year about the failure of American diplomacy in 2003. Yet it might equally be argued that President Bush and his advisors were too diplomatic in their approach. For it was above all their desire not to act unilaterally that led to the fiasco of the entirely superfluous second resolution, which would have been more like a 22nd resolution. It was not American diplomacy that failed, it was the diplomacy of those who believed they could stop the war, or at least isolate the United States. And then the U.S. invaded Iraq all the way because the U.S. had sort of seen what it had done repeatedly over the course of its history with these piecemeal attacks, with these bit by bit, send in the Marines, or with Vietnam, where it was send in some troops. It's a police action. You send more and more troops. And the U.S. is like, well, when were we successful? Okay, Korean War, massive ground invasion, smash them, we're done. Okay, then when were we successful? You know what? Desert Storm was very successful. Massive invasion force, go in, smash them, we're done. So this time what we're going to do is invade Iraq, massive invasion force, go in, smash it, we're done. None of this bit by bit, none of this trying to overthrow them from the inside. Just take the hammer and beat them upside the head. Find Saddam and cut off his. Okay. And then Bush and his advisors had grounds for acting, that Iraq had failed to comply with UN resolutions, that Saddam was a tyrant who had committed crimes against humanity. 3 further practical arguments for action seem to have been advanced. The overthrow of Saddam might help break the gridlock of the Middle Eastern peace process. That creating a democratic Iraq might also begin a wholesale transformation of the Middle East. That controlling Iraq might create alternative bases for U.S. troops in the Middle East. So basically, the U.S. is invading Iraq because A, they might have nuclear weapons. They aren't allowing the UN to inspect them for nuclear weapons, so that's just as good, right? Hey, you aren't allowing us to verify that you don't have nuclear weapons. You're basically telling the world that I'm trying to make nuclear weapons. So the U.S. says, well, that's good enough. We're going to stop you because we think you're trying to make nuclear weapons. And all you have to do is open up the bloody borders and allow the inspectors. And all of a sudden that justification for war goes away, but Saddam doesn't do it for dumb reasons, I think. Okay. And then, well, we can attack Saddam because he's human rights violations. Look at all the people he's killed and so on. But then we get to the practical arguments, which really are about increasing U.S. power in the Middle East. U.S. looks at the Middle East and says, we are friendly with Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states. We are friendly with Israel. We are friendly with Turkey. We are not friendly with Iran and Iraq. And In the past, Iran and Iraq were shooting at each other, so we were fine with that. But now Iran and Iraq are not shooting at each other. So how do we sort of break this gridlock? How do we get the Middle East to move and change in some way that is beneficial to us? Well, we can go and invade Iraq. We're already here in Afghanistan. No one's going to stop us. There's no country on the planet that really dislikes the idea of the U.S. attacking Iraq. They just sort of push against it. Okay. And January 20th, the French foreign minister declared at a press conference that the French would not associate ourselves with military intervention that is not supported by the international community. In February 10th, France and Germany were joined by Belgium in blocking an American-inspired Turkish request for assistance in the event of a war with Iraq. The same day, the Russian President Vladimir Putin visited his French counterpart in Paris to proclaim Russia's opposition to the war. On the other side, expressing support for the American position were Britain, Spain, Denmark, Portugal, and Italy, and Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic. Shortly after the first missile struck Baghdad, Chirac accused the United States of breaching the legitimacy of the United Nations and putting a premium on the use of force. Then the book says, quite what France had thus far done for the legitimacy of the UN is hard to say. Yeah. The sole French concern was to avoid a war. And then, for all the posturing of Chirac and Villepin, their policy was nothing more or less than a policy of appeasement. And it left the United States to bear nearly all the costs of the containment that policy implied. Basically, the powers of Europe don't want a war, because that would require them to actually do something. That would end up causing disturbances in the Middle East. That might change the present state of things, and France is very happy with the present state of things. France does not want uppity gumption interfering in its affairs. And sure, there may be some terrorist activities going on that are bad for France, and there may be some nuclear weapons that would theoretically be bad for France, but really that's all in the Middle East. It doesn't affect French immediately today. It's far away. It's in the future. What is French looking at? What is French looking at in 2004? We don't want to upset anything. We don't want the U.S. to have more power. And the U.S. is like, we want to upset something. We want to go in. And so you get this, again, sort of the argument about multilateralism. If you have a multilateralism, right, if you have the UN Security Council, all it requires is one person to say, nobody agrees with this. Does that make sense? Right? If you go, well, the UN denied the resolution. That sounds like the UN as a whole denied the resolution. But what it can actually mean is one country in the UN denied the resolution. It can actually mean that Russia alone denied the resolution. So this UN Security Council denied the resolution, right? One state takes in the name of everybody. And this becomes problematic because then the only way you can act unilaterally is against very weak states that are in clear violation of like genocide or something, right? And you can only do this. You're going to have to horse trade with other countries as well, right? Or it's going to be just a matter of Russia or China or England or France or Italy or Spain or Saudi Arabia, or Oman or Malaysia, whatever the country may be, that wants to interfere with another country, but also wants to stop other people from trying to interfere with its interference. And so you end up just hypocrites, essentially. At least that this is one thing that the U.S. has going for it. That when the U.S. goes in, at least according to this book, right, it is the U.S. that's going in. It's none of this multinational, the world itself declares this is correct. No, it's just straight the U.S. saying, we're going to do something about this. If you disagree, stop us. If you disagree, then put UN sanctions on the U.S. for going against the UN resolution. And it really becomes part of a question. How powerful is the U.S.? How much of the UN is U.S. creation or support? Is the U.S. an empire in the sense that it can affect... we get back to what it was talking about earlier, right? U.S. as a hegemon, it can affect the UN, it can push things in a certain way, but it doesn't mean that it rules or controls the UN directly, as I think is very clear by now. And then you have the UN, like, okay, what do we do in Iraq now that we're in charge, okay? And, okay, so it says, this book is very pro-American, right? It says, there's no gratitude in international affairs. In 2003, the U.S. went to war against a regime that had repeatedly broken international law, defied the Security Council, repeatedly murdered its own citizens, perhaps as many as 300,000 of whom Saddam caused to be executed and interred in mass graves. Most European governments supported the American decision to overthrow Saddam. Most rational people in Europe and Iraq itself welcomed the fact that he was gone. Yet a great many of the same people complained that the United States had acted unilaterally, that is, that it, rather than Iraq, was a rogue nation. This was nonsense. Already before 9/11, it was obvious that the UN was too weak an institution to deal effectively with renegade states engaged in military aggression and/or genocide. Basically, what the book is saying is that the UN talks a good talk, but doesn't walk a good walk. You can condemn what a country is doing, but it turns out that countries these days tend to be very powerful things. It turns out that you're not dealing with a situation where you send one gunboat down the river and threaten one king and turn the entire situation around. No, you're dealing with, even the smallest countries, right? You're dealing with hundreds of thousands of people, or you're dealing with millions of people. And you're trying to direct them and control, and it's just not that easy. You have to send in troops. You have to send in actual military powers to break it up, because you go into Rwanda, and you can say whatever you want. Rwanda is still dirt poor. What are you going to do? Economic sanctions on 0.0007% of international trade? And if you're doing something like the Congo, you're doing something like Iran or Russia, well, there's so many ways to evade sanctions. You can push on them, right? But if you're not willing to go in and actually militarily do an action, then you can only go so far. The UN can only ever be so effective. And then it says, well, the role for the UN was nation building, right? This was the president's view. Once the job is done, our forces are not peacekeepers. We ought to put in place a UN protection and leave. However, this did not happen. The United Nations did not go in and create a nation in Iraq. The UN did not say, we will focus all of our efforts on creating a peaceful Iraq. No, it was the US that went in, that controlled, that gave the money, that sent the weapons, that did the drone strikes, and so on and so on and so on. Why is this? Because the UN is good with, I think I would say, based on what I have from this book, right, and my own knowledge, the UN is good with money. The UN is good with talks. The UN is good with trade. The UN is good with all these countries who want to agree with one another. The UN is not good with rogue nations. The UN just does not know what the hell to do about Iran and Russia. Because economic sanctions don't matter enough. Because you're not dealing with a democratic nation. And this is hard for, I think, just a lot of places to understand. Although we're getting to see it in the US, especially. Right? You want to say, how on earth can a nation have such diverse internal views, such powerful laws, such mighty history, such an active press, and still fall into barbarism or fascism or dictatorship? You go, that must be impossible, right? Or you go, the signs must be there from the beginning, or you go, well, it must be some internal problem, like with these tribes, these foreigner people and something or other. They just aren't educated or civilized or whatnot. They're in Africa, or they're in the Balkans or in the Middle East, right? And you can tell yourself that because these countries are different, with different languages and different looking people and different histories and different religions, that those countries are different. So it is their difference that causes them to be problematic. But it's not. The same thing that happens in Iran and Egypt can happen just as easily in the US or the UK or Germany or Ukraine or Russia, right? Or Japan or Thailand. No place is as safe or stable as we think it is. And when you start involving many, many states in an action, everyone has an agenda, US included. I feel as if it's really a matter of, are they honest about the agenda or not? And, as an American, I have to ask, how honest is the United States about its agenda? How honest is China or Russia about its agenda? How honest is Hungary or Italy or France or Saudi Arabia or Azerbaijan or India honest about its intentions? How do I listen to the news and read the history and actually understand what these countries want? Or, as fragmented as they are, as fragmented as any country is with millions of people, the pressures that push a country to act in a certain way. Why do members of the UN Security Council veto certain things? Why does the issue of anything, you name it, right? Nuclear propagation, freedom of the seas, terrorism, genocide, mass deportations. Like, what's actually going on here? You can always tell us a simple story, but as something like this book shows, the story isn't very simple. When a single page mentions 14 dates and the actions of 7 countries, it's unclear exactly, what we should think or believe. And the only way I see to really go forward, right, is to read and read and read and listen and use my own sense of history to sort of understand where these countries are going. Like grow that ear so that when you hear a president on the news or you hear a politician on a radio show and they're saying something, you're going, that doesn't sound quite right. Like something seems off with that, whether it be, Xi Jinping or Putin or Trump. And you're going, okay, some of that makes sense and some of it does not. And what are you saying? What are you not saying? Right? And especially, I think what can be important is, what are you saying now? And how is that different or the same to what you were saying a year ago or a year before that or a year before that? Because if I'm hearing always a change of tone, right? Or if I'm hearing that you're always against the Democrats or the Republicans or the Americans, right? Or the Chinese, and I hear it's just the same sort of sticking point over and over again, that I'm going, okay, I'm starting to understand your actual concern over this. It's not the idea, it's the enemy you feel. Or sometimes it is the idea, right? I can say I'm trying to point out UN failures and American failures and understand that it's not that there is a good guy or a bad guy. It's not, there isn't a good or bad action always taken. There's a world of gray, which is ugly, to be sure, but it's the one we have. And black or white, ideas of human rights and genocide can occasionally shine through, can occasionally show us an ideal or an opposite of an ideal, a cursed world. But that is bad, that is wrong, or that is good, that is right. And we can say, well, how do we take this gray land we live in? How do we take our gray actions and move them so that they become clearer what is happening? What is the action we want to take? What is the effect that's going on? Who is telling the truth? And who is lying and hiding? The Price of American Empire is the title of the book. And the way I'm sort of interpreting that is, the U.S. is big. The U.S. is everywhere. And so the price of an American empire is at least partially just the fact that you are involved in all of this, that the effort never ends, that simply by existing as an economic powerhouse, as simply by existing as a democratic country or one with civil rights, simply as existing as some place with ships and boats and missiles and technology and money, you gain friends and enemies. Not because of what you do, or not only because of what you do, but simply because you are. Either a convenient scapegoat or target, either a friend, colleague, or dupe. And we can always dupe ourselves as well. There's a reason that a lot of Americans don't trust their politicians. But that doesn't mean that every politician is always untrustworthy either. And it's working out the thin line we want to walk, which is the trouble. I can get instant active, and I can get drawn into the book, the story, and say bad things about France or the US or Germany or China or the UK or Mexico. And then tomorrow, I may read something which makes me reevaluate my understanding of what happened. There's always another book. There's always something else to learn. There's always another person to talk to who has a different opinion about this, or tries to push a different opinion at least. And I want to have my own strength of mind to not be so easily swayed, but to induce that effort in me requires an understanding and a struggle with these concepts of history.